Shy waitress greeted Sheikh Billionaire's deaf mum. Her sign language left everyone shocked. The late afternoon sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Oriole, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, casting golden patterns across pristine white tablecloths. Sarah Chen moved through the dining room like a ghost, her petite frame barely making a sound, as she refilled water glasses and cleared plates with practiced efficiency. At 26, she had perfected the art of invisibility, a skill that had become both her shield and her prison. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her uniform, though impeccably clean, had seen better days. No one looking at her would guess that folded carefully in her tiny studio apartment was a diploma from Columbia University, or that she could speak 6 languages fluently, or that her master's thesis on cross-cultural non-verbal communication had once been called revolutionary by her professors. That life felt like it belonged to someone else now, someone who had died 2 years ago in the ruins of betrayal and stolen dreams. Sarah had learned to keep her head down, to smile politely, to never draw attention. The other servers barely knew her name. The managers saw her as reliable but unremarkable. The customers looked through her, as if she were part of the furniture. And that was exactly how she needed it to be, because being seen meant being vulnerable, and she had been destroyed once already by trusting the wrong person. The dinner rush was beginning when the front doors opened and the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted immediately. Sarah felt it before she saw it, the way conversations dropped to whispers and heads turned with barely concealed curiosity. She glanced up from the table she was setting, and her breath caught. 3 figures entered with the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. 2 men in impeccably tailored suits flanked an older woman, dressed in elegant traditional clothing, a flowing abaya in deep emerald silk with intricate gold embroidery. But it was the man leading them who made the entire room take notice. Sheikh Rashid al-Mansouri moved with the confidence of someone who had never questioned his place in the world. At 48, he carried himself with the bearing of royalty, which in many ways he was. His traditional white thobe and black bisht were perfectly pressed, and the Patek Philippe on his wrist cost more than most people's houses. His face was striking, sharp cheekbones and intense dark eyes that seemed to assess everything and everyone with calculating precision. But Sarah's attention was drawn to the woman beside him. She was perhaps in her early 70s, with silver hair visible beneath her hijab, and eyes that sparkled with intelligence and warmth. There was something about the way she moved, the way she held herself, that spoke of dignity and grace. Sarah watched as the maitre d' approached, bowing slightly as he greeted the sheikh in rapid, obsequious tones. "Sheikh al-Mansouri, what an honor. Your usual table is prepared. Please this way." The maitre d' gestured grandly toward the best table in the house, positioned by the window with a view of the Manhattan skyline. But Sarah noticed something that made her heart clench. As the maitre d' spoke, the older woman's eyes moved between the men's faces, trying to follow a conversation she couldn't hear. The sheikh translated briefly with his hands, quick, efficient gestures that Sarah recognized immediately as sign language. But the maitre d' never once looked at the woman or acknowledged her presence. Sarah had seen this before too many times. The way people treated those who were deaf or hard of hearing as if they were invisible, as if their inability to hear somehow made them less worthy of respect or direct communication. It was one of the things that had driven her research, the belief that communication was a fundamental human right. Regardless of the form it took, the party was seated at their table, and Sarah watched as the other servers suddenly became very busy with other tasks. She knew what they were thinking. Difficult table, language barriers, probably won't tip well anyway, better to avoid it. But Sarah found her feet moving before her brain had fully decided. She approached the table with her notepad, her heart hammering in her chest. This was breaking her own rules. Don't stand out. Don't be noticed. Don't let anyone see what you can do. Yet something about the woman's kind eyes and the way she sat so patiently while the men around her conducted business made Sarah's decision for her. She stopped at the table and did something she hadn't done in 2 years. She let herself be seen. Her hands moved with fluid grace as she signed in American Sign Language, her face animated with the expressions that gave the language its emotional depth. "Good evening. Welcome to Oriole. My name is Sarah, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. It's an honor to serve you." The effect was instantaneous and electric. The older woman's eyes widened, her face transforming with surprised delight. Sheikh Rashid, who had been reviewing something on his phone, looked up sharply, his dark eyes locking onto Sarah with an intensity that made her want to step back. But it was the woman who responded first, her hands moving with excited energy. "You sign? Oh, my dear, what a wonderful surprise. No one ever signs to me directly." Sarah smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes for the first time in months. But then she did something that made the entire table fall silent. She switched her signing style, her hands forming the slightly different patterns of International Arabic Sign Language, a variation she had learned during her research into cross-cultural communication. "I wanted to greet you in a way that might feel more familiar. I hope I'm doing it correctly. My Arabic signing isn't as strong as my ASL, but I wanted to try." The older woman's hands flew to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. She turned to her son, signing rapidly, her face glowing with emotion. Sheikh Rashid stared at Sarah, as if she had just performed a miracle. "You know Arabic Sign Language?" His voice was deep, accented with the cultured tones of someone educated in British schools, but raised in the Gulf. There was something in his tone that Sarah couldn't quite identify. Surprise, yes, but also suspicion, as if he was trying to determine if this was some kind of performance. "I studied linguistics and non-verbal communication," Sarah said quietly, defaulting back to spoken English, suddenly aware that every eye in the restaurant was on them. "I believe everyone deserves to be communicated with directly and respectfully." The older woman reached out and gently touched Sarah's hand, then signed with deliberate clarity, making sure Sarah could follow. "I am Amira Al-Mansouri. This is my son, Rashid. You have given me a gift tonight, young lady. The gift of being seen." Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. "The honor is mine, Mrs. Al-Mansouri." Rashid was still watching her with that penetrating gaze, and Sarah felt exposed in a way she hadn't in years. She quickly pulled out her notepad, trying to regain her professional composure. "May I start you with some drinks? We have an excellent wine selection, or if you prefer, sparkling water, fresh juices, or traditional Arabic coffee." Amira signed her response, and Sarah translated smoothly. "Mrs. Al-Mansouri would like mint tea if you have it, prepared in the traditional way if possible." "We do," Sarah confirmed, then turned to Rashid. "And for you, sir?" "Arabic coffee," he said, his eyes never leaving her face. "Strong." As Sarah took the rest of the drink orders and explained the evening's specials, she found herself falling into a rhythm she had almost forgotten. She signed to Amira while speaking to the others, creating a seamless conversation that included everyone at the table. She noticed the way Amira's face lit up when Sarah asked her directly about her preferences, about whether she preferred her food mild or spicy, about her thoughts on the menu options. When Sarah finally excused herself to place their orders, she could feel Rashid's eyes following her across the room. Her hands were shaking slightly as she entered the drink orders into the system. She had broken her cardinal rule. She had been seen. And worse, she had been seen by someone who clearly had the resources and the interest to dig deeper. What was that about? Marcus, one of the other servers, asked with barely concealed jealousy. "You know sign language?" "Since when?" "It's not a big deal," Sarah muttered, keeping her eyes on the screen. "That's Sheikh Rashid Al-Mansouri," Marcus continued, oblivious to her discomfort. "He's worth like $3 billion. Owns half of Dubai. If you play this right, you could get a massive tip." Sarah's stomach turned. That was exactly the kind of thinking that had gotten her into trouble before. People who saw her skills as something to be exploited, to be used for gain. She had learned that lesson the hardest way possible. She prepared the drinks with meticulous care, making sure the mint tea was steeped to perfection and the Arabic coffee was rich and aromatic. When she returned to the table, Amira greeted her like an old friend, and Sarah found herself relaxing despite her better judgment. As she served the drinks, Amira signed a question. "Have you studied Arabic culture as well as the language?" Sarah nodded, setting down the delicate tea glass. "I spent a summer in Jordan during my graduate studies, working with deaf communities there. The way different cultures approach sign language and non-verbal communication is fascinating. Did you know that there isn't one universal sign language? Each country, sometimes each region, has its own." Amira's eyes sparkled with delight. "Yes, so many people don't understand this. They think all deaf people communicate the same way. Tell me, What did you study specifically? And just like that, Sarah found herself in a conversation that went far beyond taking orders. She discussed the nuances of emotional expression in different sign languages, the way cultural context shaped non-verbal communication, the challenges and beauties of cross-cultural understanding. Amira was clearly highly educated and deeply thoughtful, and Sarah felt her academic mind, dormant for so long, coming alive again. Rashid watched this exchange with an expression that Sarah couldn't quite read. He occasionally translated for his associate, but mostly he simply observed, his coffee growing cold in front of him. When Sarah finally excused herself to check on their appetizers, Amira turned to her son and signed with emphatic gestures. "That girl is extraordinary. She's not just a waitress, Rashid. There's a story there." Rashid nodded slowly, his mind already working. "I noticed. The way she signs, the depth of her knowledge, the fact that she studied in Jordan. That's not typical for someone working in a restaurant." "Don't be a snob," Amira signed with a slight smile. "But I agree. Something happened to her. I can see it in her eyes, pain, loss she's hiding. Should I investigate?" Rashid signed back. Amira considered this, then shook her head. "Not yet. But invite her to join us for a moment when she's not busy. I want to talk to her more. And Rashid, be kind. She's fragile even if she doesn't show it." When Sarah returned with their appetizers, perfectly plated and aromatic, Rashid made his move. "Miss Chen," he said, reading her name from the reservation notes he had glimpsed. "My mother would like to know if you might join us for a moment when you have time. She rarely gets to converse with someone who understands both her language and her culture." Sarah hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to decline politely and maintain her distance. But Amira's hopeful expression melted her resolve. "I have a few minutes before my next table needs me," she said quietly, and pulled up a chair at Amira's gesture. What followed was one of the most surreal experiences of Sarah's life. Sitting in this expensive restaurant in her worn uniform, she discussed linguistic theory with a woman who, despite being unable to hear, had clearly spent a lifetime studying communication and human connection. They talked about poetry and how it translated into sign language, about the way humor worked differently in visual versus auditory communication, about the isolation that came from being excluded from casual conversation. "You understand?" Amira signed, her eyes glistening. "You truly understand. Not just the language, but the experience." Sarah nodded, her own eyes burning. "Communication is a human right. Everyone deserves to be heard, to be understood, to be included in the conversation. It shouldn't matter how we communicate, only that we do." Rashid, who had been silent throughout this exchange, suddenly spoke. "That sounds like something from an academic paper. Are you quoting someone?" Sarah froze, her blood running cold. She had been quoting someone, herself, from her thesis. The thesis that had been stolen and published under someone else's name. "Just something I read once," she said, standing abruptly. "I should check on your entrees. Please excuse me." She fled to the kitchen, her heart racing. Stupid, so stupid. She had let her guard down, had let herself fall back into old patterns, had revealed too much. Rashid al-Mansouri was clearly intelligent and observant. If he decided to dig into her background, what would he find? A failed academic with no publications, no references, no future. A woman who had been so thoroughly destroyed by betrayal that she had given up everything she loved. But when she returned with their main courses, Rashid didn't press. Instead, he simply thanked her with a slight nod and returned his attention to his meal. Yet Sarah could feel his mind working, could sense the questions he wasn't asking. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur. Sarah maintained her professional distance, but Amira drew her back into conversation several times, asking about her favorite books, her thoughts on art, her dreams for the future. Each question felt like a gentle probe, as if the older woman was trying to understand the puzzle that Sarah had become. When they finally finished their meal, and Rashid requested the check, Sarah felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. This brief window into a different life, a life where her knowledge and skills mattered, was closing. But as she processed the payment, Rashid handed her a business card along with a tip that made her eyes widen. $5,000, that's too much, she protested immediately. "I can't accept this." "It's not for the service, though that was excellent," Rashid said calmly. "It's because you gave my mother something precious. You gave her dignity and respect. You treated her not as my deaf mother, but as Dr. Amira Al-Mansouri, Professor Emeritus of Literature from the University of Dubai. You saw her. Sarah looked at Amira with new understanding. A professor, of course. That explained the depth of their conversation, the intellectual curiosity, the refined manner. Amira stood and took both of Sarah's hands in hers, signing slowly and deliberately. I would like to see you again. Would you join us for dinner tomorrow night? Not as our server, but as our guest. Please, it would bring me great joy. Every logical part of Sarah's brain screamed at her to decline, to maintain her distance, to protect herself. But looking into Amira's kind eyes, she found herself nodding. I would be honored, she signed back. Rashid's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. Satisfaction, curiosity. Sarah couldn't tell. As they left the restaurant, Amira turned back one more time and signed, tomorrow at 7. Rashid will send a car. Wear whatever makes you comfortable. We want to know the real you. But as Sarah watched them disappear into a waiting limousine, one thought echoed through her mind with growing dread. The real her was broken. And she wasn't sure she was ready for anyone to see just how shattered she truly was. That night, as Sarah lay in her tiny apartment staring at the ceiling, she pulled out her phone and did something she hadn't done in months. She searched for her own name. The results were the same as always, nothing, no publications, no academic presence. No trace of the brilliant young researcher she had once been. But there, at the top of the results, was Dr. Marcus Webb's name attached to the paper that should have been hers. The paper that had launched his career and destroyed hers. She closed her eyes against the familiar wave of pain and anger. Tomorrow she would have dinner with a billionaire, Sheikh, and his mother, and she would have to pretend that she was whole, that she was fine, that she hadn't been completely destroyed by the man she had once loved. But for tonight, alone in the dark, she let herself remember, she let herself grieve, and she let herself wonder just for a moment what it might be like to be seen again, truly seen, by people who might actually care about the truth. The next morning, Sarah woke to a text from an unknown number. This is Rashid Al-Mansouri. A car will collect you at 6:30 p.m. from your address. My mother is very much looking forward to seeing you again. As am I. The message was formal, polite, and somehow made Sarah's anxiety spike even higher. She spent the day in a fog, going through the motions of her morning shift at the restaurant, while her mind raced with possibilities and fears. What did they want from her? Why had Amira been so insistent on seeing her again? And why had Rashid included that last sentence, as am I? Was he suspicious? Was this some kind of test? By the time her shift ended at 4, Sarah was a bundle of nerves. She rushed home and stared at her closet with growing despair. Wear whatever makes you comfortable, Amira had said. But Sarah owned exactly 3 outfits that weren't her work uniform, jeans and t-shirts for her days off, and one dress that she had bought for her thesis defense and hadn't worn since. She pulled out the dress, a simple navy blue sheath that had once made her feel confident and professional. Now it just reminded her of everything she had lost. But it was the best she had, so she put it on, did her makeup with shaking hands, and tried to tame her hair into something presentable. At exactly 6:30, her phone buzzed. The car was outside. Sarah took a deep breath, grabbed her small purse and headed downstairs. A sleek black Mercedes waited at the curb, and a driver in a crisp suit opened the door for her with a respectful nod. Miss Chen, welcome. Sheikh Al-Mansouri has asked me to take you to his residence. His residence, of course. Sarah had assumed they would meet at another restaurant, somewhere public and safe. But as the car glided through Manhattan traffic and eventually pulled up to a stunning penthouse building overlooking Central Park, Sarah realized she had entered a completely different world. The driver escorted her to a private elevator that required a key card to operate. As they ascended, Sarah's reflection stared back at her from the mirrored walls. She looked terrified. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse, and Sarah stepped into a space that took her breath away. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, and the interior was decorated with a perfect blend of modern luxury and traditional Middle Eastern elegance. Rich carpets, intricate metalwork, and carefully curated art pieces created an atmosphere of refined taste and enormous wealth. But it was Amira who immediately drew Sarah's attention. The older woman was seated on a plush sofa, and her face lit up the moment she saw Sarah. She stood and approached with open arms, pulling Sarah into a warm embrace before signing enthusiastically. "You came!" "I'm so happy. Come, sit. We have so much to talk about." Rashid emerged from another room and Sarah's breath caught. He was dressed more casually than the night before, in tailored slacks and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, but he was no less imposing. His dark eyes assessed her with that same penetrating gaze, and Sarah felt like a specimen under a microscope. "Miss Chen, welcome to my home." "Thank you for joining us." "Thank you for inviting me," Sarah replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Your home is beautiful. My mother decorated most of it," Rashid said with a slight smile. "She has better taste than I do. Please sit. Would you like something to drink? Tea, coffee, wine?" "Tea would be lovely, thank you." As Rashid prepared the tea himself, which surprised Sarah, Amira patted the seat next to her and began signing. "Tell me about yourself, Sarah. Where are you from? What brought you to New York?" Sarah had prepared for this question, had rehearsed a safe, sanitized version of her life. But something about Amira's genuine interest and kind eyes made the practiced lies stick in her throat. "I grew up in California," she began, signing as she spoke so Amira could follow. "I was always fascinated by languages and communication. I studied linguistics at Berkeley for my undergraduate degree, then came to New York for graduate school at Columbia." "Columbia?" Amira signed with excitement. "That's a wonderful program. Did you complete your degree?" And there it was. The question Sarah had been dreading. I completed my coursework and my thesis," Sarah said carefully. "But I didn't pursue an academic career afterward." "Why not?" Rashid asked, returning with a tray of tea and small pastries. His tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp. "With a degree from Columbia and obvious expertise in your field, you could have had your pick of positions." Sarah accepted the tea with trembling hands. "Things didn't work out the way I planned. Sometimes life takes unexpected turns." Amira reached over and gently touched Sarah's arm, drawing her attention. "Something hurt you," she signed, her expression full of compassion. "Something or someone? You don't have to tell us if you don't want to, but I want you to know that you're safe here. We're not here to judge you or hurt you. We simply want to know you." And that was when Sarah's carefully constructed walls began to crack. Maybe it was the kindness in Amira's eyes. Maybe it was the exhaustion of carrying her pain alone for so long. Maybe it was the simple fact that these people had no connection to her past, and therefore no reason to use her story against her. Whatever the reason, Sarah found herself talking. Really talking for the first time in 2 years. "I was engaged," she began quietly, "to another graduate student, Marcus Webb. We were both studying linguistics, both passionate about communication and language. We worked together on everything, shared our research, our ideas, our dreams." She paused, taking a sip of tea to steady herself. Rashid and Amira waited patiently, not pushing, just listening. "My thesis was on cross-cultural nonverbal communication, specifically how different cultures approach sign language and gesture. I spent years on the research, traveled to 6 countries, interviewed hundreds of people. It was going to be groundbreaking. Marcus knew everything about it, because I trusted him completely. We were going to get married as soon as we both defended our theses." Sarah's hands clenched around her teacup. 2 months before my defense, Marcus submitted his own thesis. It was my research, my interviews, my analysis, my conclusions, word for word in some places. He had taken everything I had shared with him and published it as his own work. Amira's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Rashid's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. "I tried to fight it," Sarah continued, her voice breaking. "I went to the department, showed them my notes, my drafts, everything. But Marcus had been careful. He had covered his tracks, made it look like we had collaborated and I was just bitter about the breakup. Yes, he broke up with me the day after he submitted. He said I was holding him back, that I was too emotional, too soft for the academic world." "The department didn't believe you?" Rashid asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. Sarah shook her head. "Marcus's father is a major donor to the university. He's also a prominent lawyer. They threatened to sue me for defamation if I continued to make accusations. I had no money for a lawyer, no proof that would hold up in court. It was his word against mine, and he had power and connections. I had nothing. So you gave up your career," Amira sighed, tears streaming down her face. "I had no choice," Sarah whispered. My reputation was destroyed. No academic institution would touch me. I was labeled as a jealous ex-girlfriend, making false accusations. Marcus went on to publish the research as a book. It won awards. He got a position at Princeton. He's considered a rising star in the field. And you became a waitress, Rashid said softly. I became invisible, Sarah corrected. Because being seen, being known only leads to pain. I learned to keep my head down, to hide what I know, to never let anyone see my skills or my knowledge. Because the moment you show people what you're capable of, they find ways to use it against you. The room fell silent except for the quiet sound of Sarah's tears. She hadn't meant to cry, hadn't meant to reveal so much, but now that the dam had broken, she couldn't stop. Amira moved closer and pulled Sarah into her arms, rocking her gently like a child. Over Sarah's head, she signed to her son with her free hand. We help her. We fix this. This is not right. Rashid nodded slowly, his mind already working through possibilities. But he also understood something his mother, in her compassionate fury, might not fully grasp. Sarah had been betrayed by someone she loved, someone she trusted. She wouldn't accept help easily, especially not from strangers, no matter how well-intentioned. When Sarah finally pulled away, embarrassed by her outburst, Amira handed her a tissue and signed firmly. You are not invisible. You are brilliant and kind and strong. What happened to you was a crime, and the man who did it should face consequences. It's been 2 years, Sarah said wearily. There's nothing that can be done now. I just have to accept it and move on. Is that what you really believe? Rashid asked, leaning forward. Or is that what you've told yourself, because fighting seemed too hard? Sarah met his eyes, seeing not pity but challenge. What would you have me do? I have no resources, no connections, no proof that would stand up in court. Marcus has won. That's the reality. Reality can be changed, Rashid said quietly. If you have the right resources and the right allies. I don't want charity, Sarah said quickly, her pride flaring. I don't want to be someone's project or their good deed for the day. That's not what I'm offering, Rashid replied calmly. I'm offering justice. There's a difference. Why? Sarah demanded, her emotions raw and exposed. Why would you care about what happened to me? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything, Amira answered, her signs deliberate and clear. Because I know what it's like to be dismissed and underestimated. Because I've spent my life watching people talk over me, around me, about me, as if I wasn't there. Because I recognize someone who has been made to feel invisible. And I will not stand by and let that continue, Rashid added. And because I have the resources to investigate this properly, and if there's evidence of fraud and theft, I have the means to ensure it comes to light. Not as charity, but as justice. Sarah wanted to refuse. Every instinct told her to protect herself, to not trust, to not hope. But looking at Amira's determined face and Rashid's steady gaze, she felt something she hadn't felt in 2 years. She felt seen. I don't know, she whispered. I don't know if I can go through that pain again. You don't have to decide tonight, Rashid said gently. But think about it. Think about whether you're willing to fight for what was taken from you. And know that if you decide to fight, you won't be alone. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. They ate dinner, a beautiful spread of Middle Eastern and American dishes, and the conversation shifted to lighter topics. Amira told stories about Rashid as a child, making Sarah laugh despite her emotional exhaustion. Rashid revealed a dry sense of humor that surprised her, and she found herself relaxing in their company. But underneath it all, Sarah's mind churned with possibilities and fears. Could she really do this? Could she face Marcus again, risk being destroyed all over again? And could she trust these people, these strangers who had entered her life less than 24 hours ago? When the car dropped her off at her apartment that night, Sarah found a note tucked into her purse. It was from Rashid, written in elegant script. You are not broken, Sarah Chen. You are bent perhaps, but not broken. And even bent things can be straightened, can be made whole again. The question is whether you're brave enough to try. Think about it. We'll be here when you're ready. Sarah read the note 3 times before folding it carefully and placing it in her drawer, next to her Columbia diploma. Then she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time in 2 years, she let herself imagine a different future. A future where she wasn't invisible. A future where justice was possible. A future where she could be whole again, The question was whether she was brave enough to reach for it. The next 3 days passed in a strange limbo. Sarah went to work, served tables, smiled politely, and went through all the familiar motions. But her mind was elsewhere, constantly replaying her conversation with Rashid and Amira, weighing possibilities, battling hope and fear. She had looked up Rashid al-Mansouri online, something she probably should have done before going to his home. What she found was both reassuring and intimidating. He was exactly who he claimed to be, a billionaire businessman with holdings in real estate, technology, and renewable energy across the Middle East and Europe. But more than that, he had a reputation for being ruthlessly fair in business and fiercely protective of his family and those under his care. There were also articles about his mother, Dr. Amira al-Mansouri. She had been a celebrated professor of comparative literature before her retirement, had written several books, and was known for her advocacy work for deaf education in the Arab world. These weren't just wealthy people looking for a charity case. They were accomplished, intelligent individuals who had chosen, for reasons Sarah still didn't fully understand, to care about what happened to her. On the 4th day, Sarah made her decision. She texted the number Rashid had given her. "I want to fight. I want justice. If you're still willing to help, I'm ready." The response came within minutes. "Come to my office tomorrow at 2 p.m. Bring any documentation you have from your research." "We begin now." Sarah's hands shook as she read the message. There was no going back from this. She was choosing to be visible again, to be vulnerable again, to risk everything again. But she was also choosing to fight for herself, perhaps for the first time in her life. The next afternoon, Sarah stood in front of a gleaming skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan, home to al-Mansouri Enterprises. The lobby alone was more impressive than any place she had ever worked. All marble and glass and quiet efficiency. She gave her name to the receptionist, who smiled warmly and said, "Miss Chen, Sheikh al-Mansouri is expecting you. Please take the private elevator to the top floor." As Sarah rode the elevator up, she clutched her bag containing her laptop, external hard drives, notebooks, and every scrap of documentation she had kept from her graduate work. She had almost thrown it all away a dozen times, but something had always stopped her. Maybe some part of her had always known she would need it again. The elevator opened into a stunning office suite, with views that stretched across Manhattan. But Sarah barely noticed the decor because Rashid was there, along with 3 other people. A woman in a sharp business suit, a man with the bearing of a lawyer, and another man with the tech-savvy look of someone who spent his life behind computers. "Sarah," Rashid greeted her, his tone warm but professional. "Thank you for coming. Let me introduce you to my team. This is Jennifer Martinez, my head of legal affairs. David Okonkwo, one of the best intellectual property lawyers in the country. And Thomas Chen, no relation I assume, who is a forensic digital analyst." Sarah shook hands with each of them, feeling overwhelmed. This is a lot. "This is what justice requires," Rashid said simply. "Now tell us everything. Start from the beginning and don't leave anything out." For the next 3 hours, Sarah walked them through her entire story. She showed them her research notes, her drafts, her emails with Marcus. Thomas immediately began analyzing her computer files, checking metadata and timestamps. David took copious notes, asking pointed questions about dates, witnesses, and documentation. "This is good," David said finally, leaning back in his chair. "This is very good. The timestamps on your files predate Webb's submission by months. The metadata shows a clear progression of work. And these emails," he held up printouts of correspondence between Sarah and Marcus. "These show him asking you specific questions about your research, questions that only make sense if he was mining you for information." "But is it enough?" Sarah asked, afraid to hope. "His father's lawyers said I had no case." "His father's lawyers were counting on you not having the resources to fight," Jennifer interjected. "They were probably right at the time. Their circumstances have changed." Thomas looked up from his computer, his eyes gleaming. "I found something. Webb was sloppy. He didn't just steal your research. He copied entire files from your shared cloud storage. I can trace the digital fingerprints. I can prove that the files originated from your accounts and were accessed by him just days before his submission." Sarah felt her heart begin to race. "You can prove it?" "I can prove it beyond any reasonable doubt," Thomas confirmed. "This isn't just academic misconduct. This is intellectual property theft. This is fraud. Rashid, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. Here's what we're going to do. David, I want you to file a formal complaint with Columbia University's Academic Integrity Board, with all of this evidence attached. I also want you to prepare a civil lawsuit against Marcus Webb for intellectual property theft and fraud. That will be expensive, Sarah protested weakly. I'm covering all legal costs, Rashid said, his tone brooking no argument. Consider it an investment in justice. But why? Sarah asked, the question that had been haunting her since this began. Why are you doing this for me? Rashid was quiet for a moment, then said, My mother was told for most of her life that she couldn't be a professor because she was deaf. That she couldn't contribute to academic discourse because she couldn't hear. She fought for 30 years to prove them wrong, to earn respect in a world that wanted to dismiss her. When she sees someone else being dismissed, being robbed of their voice and their work, it's personal for her. And what's personal for my mother is personal for me. He paused, then added more softly. And perhaps because I've spent my life in a world where people constantly underestimate others, based on appearances, on circumstances, on prejudices. You're brilliant, Sarah. Your work deserves to be recognized, and the man who stole it deserves to face consequences. Sarah felt tears burning in her eyes again, but this time they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of gratitude, of relief, of hope. Thank you, she whispered. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. Win, Rashid said simply. Fight and win. That's all the repayment I need. Over the next 2 weeks, Rashid's team worked with military precision. David filed the complaint with Columbia, backed by Thomas's forensic analysis and mountains of documentation. The university, faced with irrefutable evidence of academic fraud, had no choice but to open a formal investigation. Marcus, confident in his untouchability, initially dismissed the complaint. But when he realized the depth of the evidence against him and the caliber of the legal team Sarah had somehow acquired, his tune changed rapidly. His father's lawyers tried to negotiate a quiet settlement, but David refused. This isn't about money, he told them coldly. This is about justice and truth. Your client committed fraud. He will face the consequences. Sarah watched all of this unfold with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. Rashid kept her informed of every development, and Amira called her daily to check on her emotional state and offer support. Sarah found herself spending more and more time with them, having dinner at the penthouse, talking for hours about everything and nothing. She discovered that Rashid was not just a ruthless businessman, but also a man of deep principle and surprising gentleness. He listened when she talked, really listened, and he never made her feel weak for her fears or her doubts. Amira became the mother figure Sarah had never really had, offering wisdom and comfort in equal measure. But it was during one late evening, when Sarah and Rashid were alone on his terrace overlooking the city, that something shifted between them. Can I ask you something? Sarah said quietly, watching the lights of Manhattan twinkle below them. Anything, Rashid replied. Why aren't you married? Someone like you, with your wealth and position, I would have thought. Rashid smiled slightly. You would have thought I'd have an arranged marriage to some suitable woman from a prominent family. Something like that, Sarah admitted. My mother refused to arrange my marriage, Rashid said. She told me that she had been fortunate enough to marry for love, and she wanted the same for me. She said I should wait until I found someone who saw me. Not my money or my title, but me. He turned to look at Sarah, his dark eyes intense in the dim light. I've been waiting a long time. I had begun to think that person didn't exist. Sarah's breath caught. Rashid, I'm not asking you for anything, he said quickly. I know the timing is terrible. You're in the middle of a legal battle. Your life is in upheaval, and the last thing you need is romantic complications. But I want you to know that I see you, Sarah Chen. I see your brilliance, your strength, your kindness. And when this is all over, when you've won your justice and reclaimed your life, I would very much like the opportunity to know you better. Sarah didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to run, to protect herself from the vulnerability of caring for someone again. But another part of her, the part that was slowly learning to be brave, wanted to stay. Ask me again when this is over, she finally said. When I'm whole again, when I'm not broken. You're not broken, Rashid said firmly, echoing his note from weeks ago. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met. But I'll wait. I'm very good at waiting for things that matter. The breakthrough came 3 weeks after the investigation began. Columbia's Academic Integrity Board, faced with Thomas's forensic evidence and testimony from several professors who had noticed inconsistencies in Marcus's work, ruled that Marcus Webb had committed academic fraud. His degree was revoked, his thesis was retracted, and he was banned from the university. But that was just the beginning. The story broke in academic circles, then in mainstream media. Princeton professor's degree revoked for fraud, read the headlines. Rising star in linguistics built career on stolen research. Princeton immediately suspended Marcus, pending their own investigation. Publishing houses pulled his book from circulation. Speaking engagements were cancelled. In a matter of days, the career Marcus had built on Sarah's work crumbled to dust. And then David filed the civil lawsuit, seeking damages and, more importantly, public acknowledgement that the research belonged to Sarah Chen. Marcus's lawyers tried everything. They offered money. They offered public apologies. They offered to credit Sarah as a co-author. But Sarah, with Rashid's support, refused everything except the full truth. "I want my name on that research," she told David firmly. "I want the academic world to know that I did that work. I want my career back." The case never went to trial. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of criminal charges for fraud, Marcus agreed to a settlement. He would publicly admit that he had stolen Sarah's research. He would transfer all rights and credits to her, and he would pay substantial damages. The day the settlement was finalized, Sarah stood in David's office, holding the legal documents that restored her name and her work, and she couldn't stop crying. "It's over," she kept saying. "It's really over." "No," Rashid said gently, his hand on her shoulder. "It's not over. It's beginning," he was right. Within days of the settlement becoming public, Sarah received emails from universities across the country. Job offers, research opportunities, invitations to speak at conferences. The academic world, embarrassed by how badly they had failed her, was falling over itself to make amends. Columbia offered her a position as an assistant professor with a formal apology from the dean. Princeton, desperate to distance itself from the scandal, offered her the position that Marcus had held. Other universities made even more generous offers, but it was Amira who suggested the option that Sarah ultimately chose. "Work with us," she signed one evening over dinner. "Rashid's foundation funds educational initiatives around the world. We need someone to head up our communication accessibility program. You could do research, you could implement real change. You could make a difference for people like me. The position comes with a full research budget, a team of your choosing, and the freedom to pursue whatever projects you think are important," Rashid added. "Plus, you'd be based here in New York working with us." Sarah looked between them, these two people who had changed her life so completely in just a few months. "You've already done so much for me." "I don't want you to feel obligated to—" "Sarah," Rashid interrupted gently. "We're not offering this out of obligation. We're offering it because you're the best person for the job, because your work is important, and because we want you in our lives, not as a charity case, but as a colleague, a friend, and perhaps someday something more." Sarah felt her heart swell with emotion. For so long she had believed that being seen meant being vulnerable, meant being hurt. But these people had shown her that being seen could also mean being valued, being supported, being loved. "Yes," she said, smiling through her tears. "Yes, I'll take the position. And yes, Rashid, I would like to explore that something more." Amira clapped her hands together with delight, signing rapidly. "Finally! I thought you two would never figure it out." The next few months were a whirlwind. Sarah officially started her position with the Al-Mansouri Foundation, assembling a team of researchers and advocates to work on communication accessibility projects around the world. Her research was republished under her own name, and she began receiving the academic recognition she had always deserved. But more than that, she began to heal. With Rashid's patient support and Amira's motherly wisdom, Sarah slowly learned to trust again, to be vulnerable again, to let herself be fully seen without fear. Her relationship with Rashid developed slowly, carefully, built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine understanding. He never pushed, never demanded, never made her feel like she owed him anything. He simply showed up day after day, proving through his actions that he saw her, valued her, and cared for her. 6 months after the settlement, Sarah was invited to give a keynote speech at an international linguistics conference. As she stood at the podium, looking out at hundreds of academics and researchers, she saw Rashid and Amira in the front row, both beaming with pride. She began her speech in spoken English, but then she switched to sign language, her hands moving with fluid grace as she spoke about the importance of inclusive communication and the value of diverse voices in academic discourse. For too long, she signed and spoke simultaneously, we have allowed barriers of language, of ability, of circumstance to silence important voices. We have allowed theft and fraud to go unchallenged because fighting seemed too hard or too expensive. We have allowed people to be made invisible because it was easier than seeing them. She paused, her eyes finding Amira's. But I'm here today because 2 people refused to let me stay invisible, because they saw value in me when I couldn't see it in myself, because they taught me that being seen isn't weakness, it's strength, and because they showed me that justice, while difficult, is always worth fighting for. The applause was thunderous, but Sarah barely heard it because she was watching Rashid, whose eyes were bright with emotion, mouth the words, I'm proud of you. That evening, at a celebration dinner, Rashid pulled Sarah aside onto a quiet balcony. I have something for you, he said. Pulling out a small box, Sarah's heart began to race. Rashid, it's not what you think, he said with a slight smile. Not yet, anyway. Open it. Inside the box was a beautiful pen, clearly antique and valuable. It was my mother's, Rashid explained. She used it to write all of her books, all of her most important work. She wants you to have it. She says you're the daughter she never had, and she wants you to use this pen to write your own important work. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I can't accept this. It's too precious. You can and you will, Rashid said firmly. Because you're family now, Sarah. My mother loves you. I love you. And we want you to know that you always have a home with us, always have people who see you and value you. You love me? Sarah whispered, her heart pounding. I love you, Rashid confirmed, his voice steady and sure. I think I've loved you. Since the moment I saw you signing to my mother with such genuine respect and kindness. I love your brilliance, your strength, your compassion. I love who you are, Sarah Chen. Not what you can do or what you've accomplished, but who you are at your core. Sarah reached up and touched his face gently. I love you too. I didn't think I could ever trust anyone again, ever let anyone see me again. But you made me feel safe. You made me feel valued. You made me feel whole. Rashid pulled her close and they stood there on the balcony, holding each other as the city lights sparkled around them. So, Rashid said after a long moment, about that not yet I mentioned. Sarah laughed, the sound full of joy and hope. Are you asking me what I think you're asking me? Not tonight, Rashid said with a smile. Tonight is about celebrating your triumph, your success, your reclaimed life. But soon, Sarah Chen, very soon I'm going to ask you a very important question, and I hope you'll say yes. I hope so too, Sarah whispered, and kissed him as the city stretched out below them, full of possibility and promise. 3 months later, at a small, intimate ceremony attended by close friends and family, Sarah Chen became Sarah Al-Mansouri. Amira signed the entire ceremony for those in attendance who were deaf, tears of joy streaming down her face as she watched her son marry the woman who had brought so much light into their lives. As Sarah and Rashid exchanged vows, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her here. From invisible waitress to celebrated researcher, from broken and betrayed to loved and whole, from hiding in the shadows to standing proudly in the light, she had learned that being seen wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace. Because when you were seen by the right people, people who valued truth and justice and love, being seen meant being truly alive. And as she looked into Rashid's eyes and signed, I love you, while speaking the words aloud, she knew that she would never be invisible again. She had found her voice, reclaimed her work, and discovered a love that saw her completely and loved her unconditionally. The shy waitress who had once served a sheikh and his deaf mother had become Dr. Sarah Chen Al-Mansouri, researcher, advocate, wife and daughter. And her story, like the sign language she loved so much, spoke volumes without needing to make a sound. Justice had been served. Love had been found, and Sarah finally was home.